for the appointment of bishops in communist China will soon go into effect, but one of the principal parties to that arrangement seems to be left out of the process. Why does it appear that the communist Chinese government has more say in the appointment of Catholic bishops than the Vatican? Joining me now to discuss is the distinguished senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and author of the brand new book, Not Forgotten, Elegies For and Reminiscences of a diverse cast of characters, most of them admirable, and now the very admirable George Weigel. George, thanks for being here. We're going to get to the book in a moment, which I loved. But I have to ask you about the report this week on these new rules in China governing clergy, scheduled to go into effect on May 1st. Now, under those rules, the state-run Catholic Patriotic Association will be responsible for selecting episcopal candidates, bishops. The candidates will then be approved and consecrated by the Chinese Catholic Bishops' Conference. The rules do not mention any role by the Vatican in appointing those bishops, despite that 2018 Vatican-China agreement reportedly involving both Chinese authorities and the Holy See. What do you make of these new rules, which seem to exclude the Vatican?
Raymond, if these rules are in fact what's going to go into effect on May 1st, it's a further demonstration of how truly reprehensible that 2018 agreement between the Holy See and the Chinese government was. It was bad enough to have the Chinese state involved in the appointment of bishops. It's worse to have the Chinese Communist Party involved in the nomination of bishops. And that's exactly what's going to happen if this patriotic Catholic Chinese Association is going to be doing the nominating. This is all very reminiscent of the 18th century Austrian emperor, Joseph II, who said he wanted to make the church a department of the police. The Chinese Communist Party seems determined to make the church a department of the Chinese Communist Party, because those rules, as you know, also specify that religious communities must promote the ideological line of the Chinese Communist Party. This is reprehensible, and that this is happening at exactly the moment when brave Catholics like Jimmy Lai and Martin Lee are on trial for simply exercising their right to free speech in Hong Kong is a real wound on the church, and it is frankly a great black mark on those who made this deal with China.
Cardinal Joseph Zen has repeatedly warned that this China deal was no good and that the Vatican was not getting anything out of it. A year ago, he told me about the choice of bishops in China. Listen.
They say the Pope has a right to veto the nomination by the communist authority, but I doubt if there is such thing in the agreement. But even suppose they really give you the right of veto, how many times you can veto? Because you will be embarrassed to veto indefinitely.
Your thoughts, George, is that an accurate read on where we are today?
It's a very accurate read, Raymond. I've discussed this with Cardinal Zen, as you have, and to set up a process in which the only thing the Holy See can do is say no, it is simply ridiculous. This is a violation of the Church's own canon law. It is a real blow against an evangelically vital missionary Catholicism in China. And if we could just continue for just a moment on some of these further rules,
Yeah, I want to share with the audience, George, some of these rules. Here, they read this way: clergy will not be allowed to organize, host, or participate in unauthorized religious activities held outside the authorized places of religious activities, and will not be permitted to preach in schools other than religious schools. Clergy must belong to one of China's state-run religions. Pastors of, quote, home churches or underground churches will not be permitted to be registered clergy. The rules also called for religious clergy training programs, for the political education of religious clergy as well as their cultural education. And clergy should also be judged on their behavior with a system of rewards and punishments in place. How should the Vatican be reacting to these rules, George?
It should immediately reopen the negotiation on the appointment of bishops. It should be vocally, publicly defending Catholics like Jimmy Lai and Martin Lee, currently on trial in Hong Kong. And it should make clear to the Chinese authorities that the Catholic Church is not going to kowtow to a totalitarian regime that wishes to use religious organizations for its own ideological and political purposes. This is the only thing that worked in facing down communist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th century. Why the lesson of that has not been learned in the Vatican, and particularly in the Secretary of State of the Vatican, is one of the great mysteries of contemporary Catholic life.
I want to talk about your new book, Not Forgotten. And it really chronicles 68 incredible people, some of whom you knew personally or admired from history. How did you choose who to include in this book, George?
Raymond, it struck me recently, earlier this year, earlier last year, that I had been writing an awful lot of obituary columns recently. I suppose this is what happens when you get to a certain age and, friends and colleagues are dying at a more rapid pace. And it occurred to me that putting those elegies and reminiscences together with earlier ones that I had written might make an interesting book, a kind of panorama of fascinating personalities from the church, from the sports world, from the political world, from the entertainment world. I've got a piece in there on Denny Doherty and Cass Elliot from the Mamas and the Papas, which I suppose dates me rather precisely. The thread running through this is that, all lives are consequential lives, because every human life is an idea of God's. And every human life is capable of being lived vocationally. We can all live vocationally. We can all live purposefully. And these are 68 examples of that, although some of them are examples of how not to live purposefully in a noble way.
You really also lay out the idea that there are lessons to be gleaned from these lives. You reflect on, and I want to run through some of the folks you mentioned. You reflect on former ambassador to the Holy See and a fellow New Orleanian, I knew her, Lindy Boggs, and how she worked to reestablish better relationships between the U.S. and the Vatican. Now, this was a big deal given the Clinton administration's fury over the Holy See's role at that 1994 Cairo conference on population and development, which I remember covering. What was the point of adding Lindy Boggs here?
Lindy Boggs was a remarkable woman who thought she was at the end of her public life, and then in her early 80s discovered a new public vocation, to be the U.S. ambassador to the Holy See, where, as you said, she did a remarkable job of repairing broken lines of communication so that when the administration changed in 2001, Ambassador Jim Nicholson could come in to succeed her and find a good working relationship between the United States government and the Holy See. Lindy was also just great fun. And
I agree.
I enjoyed in the book telling the story of how she and I outfoxed a Hillary Clinton mole who had been planted in her embassy in Rome.
No, she was a. How many other Holy See ambassadors, George, lived on Bourbon Street? Quite literally, she did. Not surprisingly, Pope St. John Paul II is included in your book. You write the following about what he saw as the key to true freedom in the 21st century. Thus, the key to the freedom project in the 21st century, John Paul urged, lay in the realm of culture, in vibrant public moral cultures capable of disciplining and directing the tremendous energies, economic, political, ascetic, and yes, sexual, set loose in free societies. A vibrant public moral culture is essential for democracy and the market. Have we forgotten some of that lesson, do you think?
I'm not sure we ever learned it, Raymond. Some of us did, of course. I think a lot of our countrymen instinctively understand that. But our public moral culture today seems to have reduced the idea of freedom to that rather witless Frank Sinatra lyric, I did it my way. And the law, the Supreme Court in 1992, in the famous Sweet Mystery of Life passage, as Justice Scalia called it, reduce the idea of freedom to mere desire, and reduce the idea of the human person to just a bundle of desires, all of them morally commensurable, and said that the function of the state is to satisfy those desires. This is not a mature idea of freedom. And we've seen some of the effects of this erosion in our country over the past year, when it has become virtually impossible to have a serious conversation about serious matters.
Yeah. Well, I love that you mention our friend Father Richard Newhouse, who, of course, grappled with these issues you're talking about, the notion of freedom, the notion of liberty, the dignity of the human person, and the civil rights struggle of the day, as he called it, the pro-life movement. I love that you underscore the duality of Father Richard here, because on the one hand, he's this voracious reader of history and theology and philosophy, and yet he loved singing around the piano and watching Talladega Nights. What's Richard's lesson here, George, that people need to recall?
Well, Richard was many, many things, but he was first and foremost a radically converted Christian disciple. He really believed that Jesus Christ revealed the truth of the world, the truth of human life, that he had been baptized into friendship with Jesus Christ, and that he met the Lord in the Holy Eucharist. That shaped his entire life. He once said to me, I don't think I mentioned this in the book, that he was often struck in walking through Manhattan and looking at those vast crowds of people, that every one of them was a someone for whom the Son of God had entered history, died, and been raised from the dead. That idea has stuck with me for 40 years.
Yeah. No, Richard was wonderful at, he would open up those, open up your eyes to things you've been looking at your whole life, and you suddenly saw them in a deeper way. I mean, it was his great gift, and he was great fun, as you remind us in the book. Talk to me about Henry Hyde. He's also profiled here in Not Forgotten. Henry Hyde is a figure who today you hear his name invoked regularly because of his Hyde Amendment. Why did you include him here?
Henry was a great friend of mine for 25 years. I did a lot of work with him over that period, including during the Clinton impeachment episode. He was the undisputed political leader of the pro-life movement in the country. He was fantastically good company, a wonderful storyteller, but a very, very serious man. A great reader of history, a very serious legislator. And he's kind of bookended in Not Forgotten with another great figure that I worked with, Scoop Jackson, the senator from Washington. And it's good to be reminded that there were these kind of solid men and women like Lindy Boggs in our public life at one point. As my friend and colleague Yuval Levine has said a lot recently, politics has become a kind of performance art rather than the art of achieving things. Henry Hyde, Scoop Jackson, Lindy Boggs were achievers. And until the American people tell their public officials, enough performance, let's get down to some problem solving, we're going to continue to have the circus in our public life that we see 24/7. And that is frankly embarrassing us all over the world.
I love the section on Herman Wouk. I didn't realize you knew him. And he lived to what, 103? Give me a sense. What did he teach you, George?
Herman was a remarkable character. He was a very, very faithful Jew. I tell the story in the book of having called him one Saturday evening here in Washington. He was living in California at the time, to congratulate him on one of his later novels called A Great Big Hole in Texas. And the housekeeper answered the phone and said, "Mr. Wouk will be happy to take your call after the Sabbath." I was very impressed. What I learned from him is that writing can be craft, that serious writing requires serious research, and that there's a nobility to the vocation of writing. I mean, he thought of his literary life in vocational terms. It wasn't just a way to make a living.
Yeah, he wrote those great volumes. I mean, it's incredible, the output over that, over that long lifetime. Of course, Cain Mutiny Trial, so many incredible works. What do you want readers to take away from this book, George, and these figures that you recall and remember?
That's a good question, Raymond. I think I'd like people to be encouraged by the fact that there are so many wonderful people in the world, so many fascinating people in the world. We have had a very, very tough year in which there's been an enormous amount of crankiness surrounding all of us. These are 68 non-cranky people to meet, and they remind us that a full life can be a noble life and a happy life in many of the cases I explore here. A lot of these people are happy warriors, and that's something to be remembered today.
I love that you recall your mother and father, too. I didn't realize your father suffered from dementia. But it was those were two moving remembrances, I thought. Why did you decide to include them? I mean, obviously, the rest of the world wouldn't know very much about them. Why include them here?
They were people of consequence for me, obviously, but I think both of my parents exemplified virtues of their generation that need to be lifted up again today. Fidelity to family, mature patriotism, devotion to Christ, Our Lady, and the Church. And I thought people might like to meet them. They were very fine people, and I wanted to include them as well as my late beloved son-in-law, Rob Susel, in the book as well.
Yeah, no, it was very moving, and again, those we learned not only about a lot of public figures whom perhaps people have heard mentioned or seen from afar. You do get an intimate understanding of them, but you get an intimate understanding also of George Weigel. So thank you for that. Not Forgotten by George Weigel, available now at the EWTN Religious Catalog, bookstores everywhere, online. Go get a copy. Thank you, George.
Thanks, Raymond.